Gentleman from the 13th District, Representative Manweller.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me start off by saying that I believe that the good chairwoman and the entire committee did a great job, because if you read through the projects that they identified in the state of Washington, they really did their homework. There are some really good projects in this package. I mean, it's a good idea that Snoqualmie Pass is open 365 days a year. It's good that our bridges are stable, and as somebody who has probably uttered his fair share of colorful adjectives while sitting on the parking lot that is the 167, a great project. I mean, they did their homework. My enthusiasm for the package begins to wane when we look at how we finance and pay for it. And that's why a lot of us over here are voting no, even though we don't want to. So, Mr. Speaker, let's start at what we're going to spend, $10 billion, and then let's work our way back to see actually how many dollars worth of projects we're going to get. And it's going to be pretty surprising. So let's start at $10 billion. That's what we're going to raise. Now, right off the top, Mr. Speaker, we're going to pay prevailing wage on all of those projects, because that's the law. And any study you read, from the left, from the right, whatever think tank, conservative, liberal, it says 30%. So, Mr. Speaker, right off the top, $10 billion, we're going to spend $3 billion of that. $3 billion with a B on prevailing wage. We're already down to $7 billion, Mr. Speaker. $3 billion. We don't get bigger roads. We don't get better roads. We just get a bigger bill. How do we explain that? Mr. Speaker, I know you're not allowed to have props on the House floor, but I would love it if the chairwoman and the ranking member could get up and tell us how many projects they could have funded, but they did not, if they had an extra $3 billion. How many fish culverts could we have fixed? How many bridges could we have repaired? How many projects that got left off the list could we have funded with an extra $3 billion? And how many extra jobs could we have gotten, Mr. Speaker? Think about that, $3 billion worth of jobs. But nope, we just gave it away. Just gave it away. Now let's go to the next one, which other speakers have already mentioned. We're, of course, going to pay an 8% sales tax. 8% of $10 billion, $800 million, Mr. Speaker. We're already down to about $6.2 billion, Mr. Speaker. We're going to spend $10 billion to get about $6 billion worth of roads and projects. But not only that, Mr. Speaker, we're going to bond to get the 8%. So we're going to spend a quarter to get a dime. If you do the math, 5%, 20 years, 25 years, 8 cents comes out to about a quarter. We're going to spend a quarter to get a dime. Only in government is that a good idea. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure you've gone into buildings and you've seen those signs. This is a smoke-free zone. This is a gun-free zone. We ought to have a sign out there in front of the Capitol. This is a calculator-free zone. If you have a calculator, we'll show you immediately to the exit.
Mr. Speaker.
Point of order.
Representative, I believe that you are passionately expressing your viewpoint, and that is allowed. The point is not well taken. Please continue.
All right, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let's rehang that sign out there, all right? Because, Mr. Speaker, only in a calculator-free zone would you spend $10 billion in taxes to get $6 billion worth of roads. Only in a calculator-free zone would you spend a quarter to get a dime, and only in a calculator-free zone would you commit the mathematical malpractice, which is the way in which we finance the projects in this state. Mr. Speaker, $10 billion for $6 billion of roads, twice as much per mile as almost any other state in the union. That could be the Washington State slogan. We can do for $10 billion what everybody else can do for $5. That is a sales pitch only Willie Loman would love. Mr. Speaker, that is frustrating because there are so many good projects in this package, and most of the people over here, this may surprise a lot of you, a lot of us wanted to vote for this, but we could not in good conscience because we could not vote for the financing mechanism of it, not the projects themselves. Meet us halfway. Meet us halfway, Mr. Speaker, and you would get a large portion of this caucus to make transportation bipartisan instead of ideological. Meet us halfway. To quote the great philosopher Jerry Maguire, help me help you. Help us help you. Help us reform prevailing wage. Help us reform the Growth Management Act. Help us reform the way we pay sales tax on transportation budgets. And we will come to your side, and we will vote for transportation packages, and we will make transportation funding a bipartisan issue instead of a partisan issue. But we need you to come our way a little bit. Work with us, compromise with us, reform a broken system that spends too much, and we will have a better transportation package. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition to this tax package. And I'll just be right up front. One of the things that is really, really concerning me about this tax package is there's nothing on the agenda following this tax vote as to how this project money is going to be spent. I mean, it would be a little different story if we were told that the following bills in the following order: House Bill 1954, House Bill 1955. We weren't. We were told 1954. That concerns me. I had a lot of concerns before that, but that's just one more piece that concerns me. That we're going to go and take a vote on possibly passing taxes today and not pass how we're actually going to spend them. Now who's going to decide all that? That's a concern. It is a tax increase, Mr. Speaker, 10.5 cents a gallon. And 6 of that's going to come this year, and it's going to come in August, when our gas prices are normally high. And that's going to hit hard a lot of people. We tried to put a referendum clause on this yesterday. We tried to take the emergency clause off and give the citizens a chance to determine whether or not they wanted to go to referendum on it, whether they wanted to challenge the decision, whether they wanted to take that out to the voters and have the chance to vote on it themselves. And then maybe if that happened, it would be implemented in December when our gas prices tend to be a little bit lower. And it would be a little bit easier ease into it for folks. But no, we're going to do it right in some of the peak times of the year for gas prices. 10.5 cents a gallon, Mr. Speaker, on top of 9.5 cents a gallon in 2005 and 5 cents a gallon in 2003. Prior to that, it was 23 cents a gallon. This will take us, by next year, 2014, an 11-year period, it'll take us from 23 to 48 cents a gallon, more than doubling the state portion of the gas tax. We have a lot of people in rural communities who have to drive vehicles that get 20 miles to the gallon because they need the four-wheel drive. We've got a lot of trucking companies, Mr. Speaker, that are getting 5 and 6 miles to the gallon. This is a huge per mile cost for those folks. Not to mention the weight fees that are added onto it. Not to mention that with this bill, we would be giving another increase in the registration fees. And we'd be giving local governments the opportunity to increase those fees even more on automobiles. And we heard about bridges that are being closed down by local governments, how local government roads are going back to gravel. And yet we heard the gentlelady from the 41st say, we're going to continue to pay sales tax into the general fund. $600 million of 18th Amendment protected money that should be going into projects, that should be putting pavement out there for motorists to drive on, is going to go into the general fund. And anybody can claim that that will go to education. Anybody can say we want it to go to education, but we know when it comes to budgeting, it depends on what the legislature does that particular year with that money as to whether or not it actually goes to education. Most states, Mr. Speaker, actually use money out of their general fund and put it into transportation. Here, the progressive state that we are, we do it exactly backwards for most people, most states. And we take it out of our transportation and put it into the general fund. We heard that it's going to create some jobs. Mr. Speaker, we said earlier this year, way back in that regular session that we had that is long ago past, that we would consider something like this. But we'd only consider it if we did something, if we passed policies that would help get all of our workers back to work, not just one sector. This doesn't get all sectors back to work. It doesn't get people back to work in all areas. There are a lot of people in the rural areas that will be left out as a result of this, yet they'll be paying for it and paying in higher cost per mile that they drive as a result of this. We keep hearing about how this is good for farmers. I'm not so sure that it is, Mr. Speaker. Farmers end up with the same situation that forest landowners end up in. When you increase the cost to harvest and to ship those materials, it doesn't get passed on to the end user. No, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to commodities, the end user sets the price. What the farmer or the forest landowner gets is what's left after all of the expense to get it there. So when we add a tax to the trucking company, when we add costs to the trucking company, which this will do, that farmer will get less per bushel of wheat. That small forest landowner will get less per 1,000 board feet for their timber. I see it. I write the contracts between the loggers and those small forest landowners. And I see what happens when those fuel prices hit, when those fuel prices go up. And this will cause fuel prices to go up. Some of the reforms that we requested, Mr. Speaker, was about the sales tax. Let's take that and put it back into roads. That's a reform that would get us more projects done. And the gentlelady said, $600 million worth. We tried to offer amendments to this bill yesterday, Mr. Speaker, that would get more of this going to roads, to deal with the bridges that the local governments are shutting down, to deal with those roads that are going back to gravel at the local governments. And I'm troubled that we weren't able to hang those, and we're passing this without that. There's 2 strikes against it right there in just one issue. Bonding. Yeah, we're going to bond a lot of this out for 25 years. And most of those jobs are going to get used up in the first 10. And then what happens the next 15? Very minimal. And I can tell you what will happen after 10 years, Mr. Speaker, because it's happening after 10 and after 8 years since the last packages. Somebody will come back and say, in order to keep us working, we need you to take more money out of the taxpayer's pocket, because that's what's being asked with this bill. We will be right in the exact same spot we are now in 10 years if we do this package, or very close to the same spot. There's a lot of problems with DOT. And even if we assumed that the gentlelady from the 41st was right and that this was a responsible package, the question is, do we have a DOT that's responsible enough to handle it? We've heard in testimony in the Transportation Committee, Mr. Speaker, that our projects are costing anywhere from 1.5 to 2.5 times what they're costing everywhere else. And we're always, always higher than everybody else. One of the things that we said is we need to get those costs down. In fact, Mr. Speaker, we are going to be doing a study this summer on cost drivers. So why are we raising taxes before we do the cost driver study and find out what kind of recommendations and what kind of policies we could implement to reduce the costs? Why are we going to go spend the money before we do that? Any company would do those things first. Anybody in the private sector would look for those efficiencies first. And in fact, the citizens in my district, Mr. Speaker, are demanding that we do that first. And because we're not doing that first is another reason why I have to rise in opposition to this. Some of the problems that we've seen with DOT, the 520 pontoons, numerous change orders early on in the Alaska Way Viaduct construction, problems with the Columbia River crossing. We've been overpromised and we've gotten underperformance on that. We were promised certain things for $50 million. We're $170 million into it, and we still don't have it. That's a huge, huge cost, Mr. Speaker, and it's all coming out of the taxpayers. It doesn't matter whether it's coming out of state funds or federal funds, it's costing our taxpayers. And the taxpayers have had enough. The taxpayers can't bear anymore, especially 10.5 cents on something that is absolutely critical to them getting back and forth to work, getting to the grocery store to buy food, to put it on the table, because that'll take money away from their ability to buy at the grocery store, and it'll raise the cost of goods potentially at that grocery store. The emergency clause, Mr. Speaker. If this was an emergency, why wasn't it done back in the regular session? Mr. Speaker, we've known about some of the problems. The real emergency is addressing the problems in DOT. Because, Mr. Speaker, what we're voting on here today is not a transportation budget. We already passed the transportation budget back in the regular session, and the governor signed it into law. So we already have a transportation budget. So that's another reason why I can't support this.
Regrettably, your 10 minutes has expired, Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Kind of picking up where my colleague left off. Kind of taking up there. My wife and I we're looking at building another house, and the reason is because so our parents can come to visit. They don't have all the stairs to deal with, and as we age, we're looking that at some point we may not appreciate those stairs either. So as we're doing that, we're trying to keep the costs down to make it affordable and so on. Now, I would imagine that if you happen to want to move to the 47th District and enjoy our beautiful area, that if you went to the same neighborhood that I'm considering and you had the chance to buy a similar house, that you wouldn't be particularly pleased if the price of your house was about double the price of my house, if things were comparable. So I wouldn't expect that you would say, okay, well, it's a high price, so I'm going to go out and get a second job to pay for that. That wouldn't be your first inclination. Your first inclination would be to say, why is this guy's house half the price of the one that I want? And you'd work on getting the price down, figuring out what's this guy doing right that he can get the cost down. So I think that this is an analogy to what we're doing to our constituents today, is we're saying if we pass this bill, we're saying, okay, we're paying double for our projects that what people pay in other states or what other states invest in their projects. And, well, don't worry about the price, just get another job. Find a way to pay for it. Pay those extra taxes that they really can't afford to do. So it's a serious problem. I think we're doing things in the wrong order. And as we were mentioned before, we need to get the costs down first. And once the costs are down, then we can consider how we're going to pay for those things. Now, I recognize that we have some serious transportation problems in this state. I know that we need to complete 167, 509 to connect to our ports. Those are serious and urgent things. But if we just keep on our status quo, keep spending the money at our current rate without looking at those reforms that we've been talking about to get the price down, it's not sustainable. It's no wonder we're behind. We can't afford the prices that we're paying now. We have to get those costs down first. So as soon as we get those going, as soon as we have the study this summer, we need to jump right on it, get those projects going, but we have to do things in the right order. We can't just ask our constituents to come up with the money right now. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen of the House, I'd like to thank the gentleman from the 34th for his comments so I don't have to follow the gentleman from the 13th. You know, as we stand here today and we think about the gas tax and what's happening, we stood together as a body early this session and we put out reforms. What we could support, what needed to change, what in Washington could make a difference that we could have a transportation system that worked and we could be proud of it. And with those reforms, we found money of gas tax that we left on the table. We would like to see those reforms enacted, but they weren't, Mr. Speaker. Instead, we're looking at a budget today that's going to take 60% of the revenue to move 3% of the population. That doesn't make sense. That's not a reform. Our reforms said basically that we would no longer go out and overbond the transportation packages, that we would do maintenance and preservation for the projects that we did. But guess what? That's not the Olympia way. Because according to the way we do things, we have to have more and more packages and more projects to get more and more votes to get that out of this body, which means we can't do the maintenance on the projects that we have, Mr. Speaker.
Representative, please do not assign motives to members for their votes. would you please, confine your remarks to the policy at hand? Please continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will endeavor to do so. Mr. Speaker, we want to make sure that we have the maintenance available for the projects that we have and that we don't overcommit our bonding capacity. That's important to us. But instead, we're seeing a package in front of us that bonds into the future and spends too much on projects and not enough on maintenance. Good? Okay. The second thing I guess I want to talk about, though, is what it's doing to the working poor. Okay, you have all these people out here that have to commute farther and farther to find work. And they have to drive more and more. And they sit there and they have to spend more and more money. And these aren't the people that can afford the Prius. This is the gentleman in the 83 Vega that's sitting there trying to get through traffic, trying to work his way to work, trying to get a job, trying to feed his family, the working poor. Can he afford another 20 cents? Can he afford another 10 cents? Can he afford, let's say this guy works and lives in King County. Lord help him, because guess what? Under this bill with the MBET, he is going to have to pay an extra $400 to register a car that's worth like $25,000. Let's just say he goes out and gets something worth that. He's going to have to pay $400 more. Or if he goes to visit the city of the gentleman in 34th, who probably needs a better mechanic, he's going to have to take and maintain his car because we spent too much on new projects and not enough on preservation and maintenance, Mr. Speaker. Those are the plans that we would support. We gave out 9 reforms at the beginning of session this year of things we would do if you want to move our state forward. 9 reforms. We ourselves, when I met with the Speaker, talked about what we needed to do to change the way we do business because we're designing ferries that don't float and bridges that don't float. We need to have something different happen in Washington State. You can't change the system today if you keep feeding the beast. You have to say to him, no, we're not going to give you any more money until you change the way you do it. You have to safeguard our dollars. Every day it gets more and more expensive on the families of Washington State to fill their car. They're hurting. And we could make a difference today by not doing this. And we could do the reforms and save money and actually have money for maintenance and preservation. But we choose not to, Mr. Speaker. You know, the ironic thing is, no one's even brought this up, is we're driving up the cost of education for our school districts. Who, you know, this has been an education session. We're supposed to be doing a better job funding it, and we're creating a larger gap because our school districts are going to have to pay more and more for the transportation costs to move our children in and out. Mr. Speaker, I would love it if our state could move forward like the other states and get a message on taxes. Look at the states that are moving towards prosperity today. They have a better regulatory scheme and a lower tax system that spurs economic development. So the people in my district, 40,000 people a day, don't have to get in their cars and drive to Tacoma and Olympia to find work and pay more and more at the pump just to find work, travel farther and farther because businesses are leaving just to find work. Mr. Speaker, I would like to see it where we can actually have a state that keeps our costs down, that runs a government that we can all be proud of, a transportation system that is not falling apart because of inequities, and that's not falling apart because of mismanagement, but is prospering because of design build, that is prospering because of good maintenance, that is prospering and the people trust us. So when we go to them and say we need a gas tax, we don't get resounding no's in the 70% range on town halls. We don't get resounding no's that when you send this to a referendum, not only are they going to vote it down, they're going to vote it down and be annoyed. We need to do something different in Olympia today in order to make it better for our children tomorrow. And the most important thing that we can do is be good stewards of our dollars in the future. And then we won't be the joke of the United States when we have the joke, what do bridges and ferries in Washington have in common? They both sink. We don't have to hear that anymore. We can say, no, that's not true. We've reformed our government, and we actually are doing quality projects with quality money. So, Mr. Speaker, we would have loved to vote yes. We put out a package at the beginning of the year of how we would vote yes, and none of those reforms were listened to. So, Mr. Speaker, I stand before you disappointed today that we're just taking this political shot across the way, and we're not going to see any answers come out. Thank you.